So, if we look ahead to the final quarter of 2032, there's this massive legal tripwire set to go off inside the U.S. government.
Yeah, it is a terrifying deadline. And basically what it really means is that every available fiscal correction between now and the early 2030s is, well, it's a ticking clock.
Right, because if nothing changes by that exact date, the trust fund supporting Social Security legally depletes.
Exactly. Which instantly triggers a surprise. Across the board, 22% haircut to benefits overnight.
Wow, just overnight.
Just overnight. And if we wait too long, the solutions just become, increasingly harsh, way more disruptive to the economy, and honestly, significantly less democratic.
Which brings us to today's mission. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are unpacking a highly ambitious $1.9 trillion survival plan designed to stop that 2032 tripwire from ever going off.
It's a fascinating document.
It really is. The primary proposal we're looking at is called the Zero Deficit Ledger, authored by an analyst named Beatrice. But we aren't just looking at her plan in a vacuum, right?
Right? No. We also have a deeply critical analysis of it by a reviewer named Virgil, alongside a really granular legislative feasibility breakdown by a third contributor, Claude.
Yeah, so our goal for you listening today is to pull apart this ledger, examine the intense mathematical and political critiques it faces, and then reveal the fully synthesized master plan they all ultimately agree on.
But before we jump into the weeds here, we should probably set some ground rules for this discussion.
Absolutely. I need to make something explicitly clear. This document is packed with heavily debated, politically charged concepts.
Right.
We're talking about aggressively taxing wealth, making massive cuts to national defense, and completely overhauling social programs.
Yeah, very heavy stuff.
And we are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing any of these viewpoints. Our only job today is to act as your impartial guides through this source material, just to help you understand the arguments and counter-arguments being made by the authors.
Exactly, because this isn't just some dry debate about spreadsheet solves. When you really read through these documents, you realize this is fundamentally a high-stakes test.
A test of what, exactly?
Of whether the American constitutional system still retains the capacity to make binding, collective decisions before a crisis forces its hand.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the foundation of Beatrice's plan, because her proposal in the Zero Deficit Ledger is, it is incredibly aggressive.
Oh, yeah. She is proposing the complete elimination of the projected $1.9 trillion federal deficit, and she wants to do it by fiscal year 2026.
Which is practically tomorrow in government time.
Yeah.
She argues that whoever takes office in the next administration essentially has to pull off a Bill Clinton Part 2.
Right, meaning a massive fiscal reckoning that actually closes loopholes and monetizes federal assets to literally get to zero.
And she brings very specific receipts to get to that $1.9 trillion number, right?
She does. The heavy hitters in her ledger are massive structural changes. For instance, she proposes restoring Clinton-era tax rates, which she calculates would generate about $900 billion.
Wow. Okay, so almost $1 trillion right there.
Exactly. Then she proposes cutting 1/3 of the national defense budget, saving $333 billion.
1/3. That is a massive cut.
It's huge. And then she wants to uncap Social Security taxes on capital gains to pull in $186 billion.
Okay.
And finally, she implements a 0.1% financial transaction tax on Wall Street trades to generate another $85 billion.
So if you step back and look at those targets, you can really see the philosophy at play here. If the national budget is a sinking ship, this plan isn't throwing the economy class passengers overboard to save weight. It's tossing the solid gold grand pianos from the first class lounge.
I love that analogy. And to take that piano analogy further, that is exactly what Virgil, the first reviewer, highlights when he talks about the plan's moral architecture.
Moral architecture, what does he mean by that?
Virgil points out that Beatrice is actively forcing the burden of this fiscal reconstruction onto very specific groups. Accumulated wealth, corporate monopolies, inherited fortunes, and what she considers unnecessary military commitments.
So she's explicitly avoiding trying to balance the budget on the backs of everyday people.
Exactly. She avoids cutting poverty programs or enacting generalized austerity on the working class. And Virgil praises this. He argues that historically, a targeted wealth compression is just fundamentally more defensible to the public than across-the-board cuts.
But here is where we hit a massive reality check. Because I'm looking at this $1.9 trillion target, And both Claude and Virgil step in to flag a gaping mathematical flaw in Beatrice's logic.
Yeah, Claude actually argues that targeting the total $1.9 trillion deficit is a total category error.
Wait, why is it a mistake to try and pay off the whole deficit number you see in the headlines? I mean, isn't that the goal?
It seems like it should be, but it comes down to understanding the anatomy of what that $1.9 trillion actually represents. Claude breaks it down. That total number is composed of two entirely different things.
Okay, what are they?
It's about $850 billion in what economists call the primary deficit.
Right.
And then it's over $1 trillion just in interest on existing debt.
Okay, so to put that in household terms for everyone listening,
Mhm.
the primary deficit is what you are, like putting on the credit card this year for groceries and gas, and the interest is what the bank is charging you for the balance you've carried for the last 20 years.
That is a perfect way to put it. And Claude argues that targeting the interest directly is legislatively impossible. You can't just pass a law that says, well, we owe less interest on the money we already borrowed.
Right, because the interest is just the compounding mathematical reality of past decisions.
Exactly. The only thing a government can actively legislate today is the primary balance. You know, the gap between current tax revenues and current non-interest spending.
Okay, but Beatrice could just say, fine, we need to raise enough revenue to cover both the $850 billion primary deficit A&D, the $1 trillion in interest. Why does Claude say we mathematically don't need to do that?
Because of this crucial macroeconomic equation that Claude introduces, its R is approximately equal to G.
R is approximately equal to G. Okay, what does that mean?
It's the idea that the effective interest rate the government pays on its debt, which right now is projected around 3.8%, is basically tied with the nominal growth rate of the overall economy, which is also around 3.8%.
Oh, I see. So because those two numbers are moving at the same speed, they basically neutralize each other.
Exactly. If the economy is growing at the same rate that the debt is compounding, tax revenues naturally rise to cover the interest. So Claude proves mathematically that closing just the primary deficit, that $850 billion gap, is actually enough to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio.
So you don't need to shock the system by finding $1.9 trillion?
No, you don't.
Which makes total sense, because if the math shows we only need to fix the $850 billion primary deficit, isn't a $1.9 trillion sudden contraction going to totally shock the system?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, pulling that much out of the economy all at once would just crater GDP, right? It feels like prescribing chemotherapy for a broken arm.
That is precisely Claude's warning. A shock of that magnitude destroys the political coalition you'd need to sustain the plan. But, and this is where Claude shows his anxiety about the math, targeting only the primary deficit puts the country on a terrifying knife edge.
A knife edge. How so?
Because that R equals G equation relies on interest rates staying tied to growth. If inflation spikes, or, bond markets panic, and interest rates rise by just a sustained 1% above the growth rate, the math just explodes.
Wait, really? Just a 1% rise?
Yeah. The government suddenly needs an additional $370 billion a year in primary surplus just to stand still.
Just to stand still.
Wow.
Which means any slight breeze in the bond market knocks the whole plan over.
Right. And this is exactly where Beatrice pushes back hard in the source material. She argues that interest absolutely must be part of the initial calculation because you can't just ignore a $1 trillion bill and hope the rates behave.
That's a fair point.
Plus, she argues that if Congress executes a massive, credible $1.9 trillion plan, it would actually calm the bond market so much that interest rates would naturally fall.
And this is a fascinating moment in the debate, right? Because Claude runs the numbers on her counter-argument, and he actually concedes the point.
He does. He notes that if the global bond markets really believe this fiscal settlement is truly durable, it could yield 70 to 105 basis points of relief on Treasury yields.
Let's translate that for a second. A basis point is 1/100th of a percent, right?
Yeah.
So 100 basis points is exactly a 1% drop in interest rates.
You got it. And on a national debt the size of the United States, dropping the interest rate by just that much translates to saving $280 to $420 billion a year in interest costs alone.
That is massive. So it's a huge vindication of Beatrice's urgency.
Yeah.
By going big, you actually change the weather in the bond market.
Exact.
Okay, but we're still left with the reality that a sudden $1.9 trillion contraction is going to hurt. It's going to trigger a recession. Why is Beatrice so willing to aggressively push for a managed recession?
It goes right back to that ticking clock we talked about at the very beginning, the fourth quarter of 2032.
Right. The Social Security cliff.
Yes, Beatrice defends the idea of a managed recession because she argues it is vastly preferable to the alternative. If Congress does nothing, that old age and survivors insurance trust fund depletes.
And that 22% haircut to Social Security benefits isn't just some policy proposal. It is existing law.
Exactly. She's basically arguing that a planned economic contraction where the government is at the steering wheel and people can prepare is fundamentally safer than a catastrophic benefit cliff just landing on seniors overnight.
Wow. It's a stark choice. But then Claude looks at this looming crisis, and he offers a totally different fundamental diagnosis of why we are in this mess. He argues that the deficit isn't actually fiscal condition at all.
Right. He calls the deficit the accounting residue of a specific institutional incapacity.
Which sounds very academic. Let's unpack what institutional incapacity really means in this context.
Well, it basically means the public has watched the government fail to deliver basic competence for the last 30 years.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Claude cites these incredibly visceral examples in the text. He points to major American cities living under boil water notices for weeks because the infrastructure is crumbling. He points to the massive unchecked fraud in the PPP loan program during the pandemic.
Right, so his core argument is psychological then.
Exactly. You cannot ask a public that has completely lost faith in the state's basic ability to deliver outcomes to suddenly consent to a 12% tax increase. People don't mind paying for a functioning society, but they deeply resent throwing money into a void.
Consent to taxation is downstream of visible delivery.
Exactly.
This raises an important question then. If people inherently don't trust the government to spend the money well, how do you make a massive tax overhaul politically survivable? Because any politician who votes for a huge tax hike is going to get crushed in the next election.
And Claude introduces a brilliant design rule to solve this exact problem. He says every taking must be paired with a highly visible giving.
Okay, taking and giving. How does that work?
He argues that you take 15 to 20% of the revenue generated by any new tax or budget cut, and you spend it immediately on a localized, highly visible public good.
So it's not about sweetening the deal. It is about proving to the skeptical taxpayer that the state can actually execute a task.
Yes, and the examples Claude gives in the document are just so clever in how they build a constituency.
Yeah, for instance, he says, if you implement that 0.1% financial transaction tax on Wall Street, you take a fraction of that new revenue and you use it to fully fund free, pre-filled tax returns for every citizen.
Right. You eliminate the headache of tax season. Every single taxpayer sees and feels that benefit annually, meaning they will fight to keep the Wall Street tax in place just to protect their free tax returns.
That is brilliant.
And he does the same thing with cuts. If you repeal agriculture and oil subsidies, which, usually causes massive backlash in rural districts, you take 20% of those savings and use it to stabilize closing rural hospitals in those exact same counties.
So the district absorbing the economic loss of the subsidy immediately feels a tangible, life-saving win with their hospital staying open.
Exactly. And without these givings, Claude warns that Beatrice's plan has a half-life of exactly one election cycle.
Right, because the next majority would just campaign on repealing the painful taxes, win, and undo all the progress.
Precisely. And remember our bond market discussion. If the bond market thinks a tax plan is just going to get repealed in 2 years, they won't lower the interest rates. The credibility of the entire plan relies on building a voting constituency that will defend the law.
All right, so we fixed the math, and we have a psychological strategy to make it politically survivable.
Yeah.
But how do you actually pass this through a deeply divided, gridlocked Congress? Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yes, this is where Claude introduces the vehicle ledger.
Right. Claude takes Beatrice's entire $1.9 trillion plan and completely reorganizes it. He stops looking at the policies by their economic category and starts organizing them by the legislative vehicle required to pass them.
Specifically, he separates what can pass the Senate with a simple majority of 51 votes versus what absolutely requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster.
And for those listening who might not follow Senate procedure closely, normally almost any major bill needs 60 votes to pass in the Senate. Getting 60 votes in a highly polarized era is incredibly difficult, which is why things just stall.
But there is a procedural cheat code.
The cheat code?
Yes, it's called reconciliation. It lets you pass bills related to the budget with just 51 votes. The catch is, this process is governed by something called the Byrd Rule.
Named after former Senator Robert Byrd.
Right. And it puts strict guardrails on what kind of policies can ride in this fast lane 51-vote vehicle.
And this is where Claude's analysis yields a pretty shocking result, right? We always hear about how impossible it is to pass anything big, but Claude finds that 65% of Beatrice's massive $1.9 trillion plan actually qualifies to pass with just 51 votes under the Byrd rule.
It's amazing. But he also highlights a massive, often overlooked asymmetry in the Byrd rule itself.
Yeah, explain that asymmetry.
So the Byrd rule forbids reconciliation bills from increasing the deficit beyond a 10-year window. Historically, this rule has strictly forced tax cuts to expire after 10 years.
Right, which is why the major tax cuts of 2001, 2017, and the ones coming up in 2025 all had built-in expiration dates.
Exactly. But here is the asymmetry. Revenue increases, meaning tax hikes, actually reduce the deficit. So if passed through reconciliation, they can be made permanent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Claude shows how Beatrice's plan could use this exact same rule that usually creates temporary tax cuts to lock in permanent revenue.
It's flipping the procedural script. But there is a massive catch, and it goes right back to the central crisis we started with. Social Security.
Yes, the Byrd rule has a specific clause that strictly forbids any changes to Title II of the Social Security Act. It doesn't matter if it saves money or costs money.
So Beatrice's $186 billion proposal to uncap Social Security taxes on capital gains.
Claude points out it is completely dead on arrival as a 51-vote reconciliation bill. The Senate parliamentarian would just strike it from the bill immediately.
The irony here is just staggering. I mean, the single most crucial deadline in this entire fiscal crisis, the Q4 2032 Social Security cliff, where benefits get slashed by 22%, is the one thing that legally requires 60 votes.
Right. It cannot ride in the fast 51-vote lane. It requires the slow, grueling, generational bipartisan vehicle.
Which leads to a major strategic pivot for the entire document. Claude advises that a new administration has to basically split the plan.
Exactly. In year one, put the tax-based changes, the health care caps, and even a statutory cap on defense spending into a 51-vote reconciliation bill.
Get all that revenue locked in permanently.
Yes. Then, because you've stabilized the primary deficit, you spend all of the president's remaining political capital over the next few years negotiating the 60-vote Social Security fix with the opposing party.
Okay, so bringing this all together, we have Beatrice's incredible ambition to hit zero, Virgil's critiques about the moral architecture, and Claude's grueling reality checks regarding the math and the Byrd rule. How do they synthesize all of this into one final, actionable master plan for the 2029 Congress?
Well, they align on a clear, phased timeline. The synthesized master plan abandons the day one zero deficit idea. Instead, the new target is achieving primary balance by 2034 and full balance by 2040.
Which makes sense. By sequencing it this way, they use the interest rate savings from the first phase to help finance the second phase. The plan basically becomes progressively easier as the savings compound.
And as they finalize this master plan, they find some incredible compromises on the specific policies. Take the telecom spectrum royalties, for example.
Oh yeah, this was a huge point of contention.
Yeah. Beatrice originally wanted to charge telecom companies a massive $68 billion annual fee for using public airwaves for cell service and data. Virgil thought that was wildly too high. He argued she was basically inventing a punitive property tax on air.
But Claude steps in and synthesizes a perfect solution. He says, hey, don't treat the wireless spectrum like property. Treat it like a public mineral estate.
Exactly. When a company drills for oil on public land, the government charges a 15 to 20% royalty for extracting public wealth. If you apply that exact same legal framework to telecom revenues, Beatrice's $68 billion target is actually highly defensible in court.
But Claude points out a glaring issue with that, right? If you slap a 20% royalty on telecom companies, they aren't just going to absorb the loss. They will pass that cost directly onto consumers.
Right, which turns this policy into a highly regressive phone tax that disproportionately hurts the working class.
Exactly. So the synthesized master plan goes back to the takings and givings rule. They pair the new royalty with a massive expansion of the Lifeline rebate program.
That's the federal program that subsidizes phone and internet service for low-income households, right?
Yeah. This protects vulnerable consumers from price hikes while still allowing the government to capture the corporate revenue from the spectrum.
It's a brilliant structural fix. And then there's the wild card in all of this.
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence. Beatrice looks at the coming AI productivity boom and compares it to the Web 1.0 tech boom of the 1990s.
Right. She makes the point that the 90s tech boom generated so much unexpected tax revenue that it's what actually allowed Bill Clinton to balance the budget in the first place.
And Claude completely agrees with her historical analogy, but he issues a stark warning based on what happened next.
What happened next?
Well, the 1990s tech windfall was very real, but it wasn't saved. Because there were no guardrails in place, that surplus was almost instantly converted into permanent tax cuts in 2001 by the next administration.
Right, the money literally evaporated the second it appeared.
So, to prevent that from happening with AI, the synthesized plan includes a requirement for a statutory windfall banking rule.
How does that actually work in practice?
It creates an automated trigger inside the Treasury Department. It basically dictates that if AI creates a sudden surge in tax revenue above a certain baseline, that excess money is legally forced into paying down the national debt.
Oh, wow. So it bypasses congressional appropriation committees entirely.
Entirely. It cannot be spent on new programs, and it cannot be used to fund tax cuts without Congress having to overcome a new 60-vote threshold to undo the rule.
It essentially puts a padlock on the cookie jar before the cookies even arrive.
Exactly. And if we take a step back and connect this synthesized master plan to the bigger picture, it does something profound. It trades the theatrical promise of an immediate day one zero deficit for something much more valuable to the global markets and the public.
Credibility.
Credibility. By phasing the approach, by carefully pairing takings with givings to build trust, and by respecting the procedural reality of legislative vehicles, it demonstrates that the republic can still govern itself.
It proves we can thoughtfully husband our inheritance and transfer a viable, functioning state to the next generation rather than just handing them an exhausted balance sheet.
It's incredibly hopeful, honestly.
It really is an incredible intellectual journey. I mean, we started with Beatrice's sledgehammer $1.9 trillion math equation. We discovered the precarious knife edge of interest rates tying growth to our debt. We learned how to legally navigate the Byrd rule to make revenue permanent. And we ended up with a brilliantly synthesized, politically viable blueprint for American fiscal survival.
It's a lot to take in, but it's essential.
It is. So what does this all mean for you listening? I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over or explore on your own.
Well, for it.
Claude argued that the deficit isn't just about math. It's a symptom of a government that has forgotten how to deliver visible wins to its people. So look around your own community today. Look at your local infrastructure, your daily interactions with federal agencies, or just think about the last time you filed your taxes.
Right.
If the government suddenly asked you for 12% more of your income to fix the national debt, what specific visible win would they have to deliver to your doorstep tomorrow to actually earn your consent?
That is a great question to end on.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers behind the headlines, and we'll catch you next time.